Hi, everybody. Brian from Minnesota. So, what are 5 questions that Kamala Harris needs to answer in order for her to position herself to win this presidential election? Now, kind of the big picture frame is, I've talked about this in the past, is that right now, I think the Harris campaign is trying to figure out what they want to do and be. And as a result, they've kind of retreated into the bunker and haven't been doing media, have mostly focused on rallies and kind of controlled set pieces while they tighten up their message. And so as she starts to transition into the kind of normal campaigning season where she defines what her campaign is and answers questions, here are the 5 things that I think, the 5 questions and answers that I think will determine her success in this campaign. The first is, what do you actually believe? Now, this is maybe snarkier than I intended it to sound, but it's obviously clear, and her campaign has admitted as much, that she has changed her mind on a whole host of issues, from policing and housing, insurance, health insurance, that is, affirmative action, climate, fracking, a whole host of things. Now, her answers have substantively changed. These aren't, small little tinkerings on the margins. I will also say that I like the idea of a politician who will change their mind as the information they get changes and as their experience grows. So I'm not just writing off the idea that if you change your mind, you're some irredeemable flip-flopper. But you do need to explain why you changed your mind on different subjects and to have a coherent response, because if you don't, it'll just sound like the reason that you've changed your mind is simply that you're looking to gain a new office and the old positions you held aren't popular. And so it's the old thing about, she has to demonstrate that she's a thermostat and not a thermometer. She has to explain why she changed her views, that she does have substantive opinions about things, and that she's willing to lead the public on the things that she cares about and not just kind of follow the polls. Second, why do you want to be president? Now, this seems like such a second grade question to ask, and in some ways is the simplest question. But how someone speaks the language of Americana, the things that they identify as really important to them and core to their mission, will tell you a ton about the kind of president that they're going to be. In my other line of work, I help people get into graduate schools. And last year, I had a podcast that I did with Duke Fuqua, which is the business school at Duke University, their dean of admissions, Russ Morgan. And he said that, when he was assessing MBA applications, one of the things he looks for is how often the person uses we words, that is, collective pronouns, versus when they use me words, as singular, like I did this, etc. And that's both a good advice for people who are applying to schools, but also it's a good way to measure and assess someone's speeches. So next time you hear a politician give a speech, look at the balance between how often they only talk about themselves and what they're going to do, and how often they speak about their broader vision of what they expect the nation and the community to be. There should be a healthy balance. You obviously need to talk about what you personally have experienced and hope to do, but there also needs to be kind of a collective sense of, I'm looking to lead, and this is the vision that I have for the country. And so when you ask someone why do they want to be president, there should be a lot of we in there. And if there isn't, then that's a bit of a red flag. Question 3, what is your vision for America's role in the world? My guess is that Harris will kind of coast on Biden's foreign policy. I think that he is, for the most part, done a pretty strong job on foreign policy, given kind of the tumult of the world. Americans a lot of times assume that our country has an outsized ability to prevent people from ever acting up. That's a little bit silly and immature and sloppy thinking. There's no amount of American strength that is just going to force people around the world not to go to war. Biden has been thoughtful for the most part. There are times when I felt on Ukraine, for example, he could have acted more assertively, but he's been engaged. And my suspicion is that the basic beats of his foreign policy will be carried over by Harris. But it's also true that she's apparently made it clear that Anthony Blinken and Jake Sullivan, who are the Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, won't have a role in her new administration. It would have been unusual for them to carry over at any rate, but it is notable that they made a point of saying so. Part of this could be that they're trying to stop kind of a left-wing revolt over the Gaza issue. But lastly, I would just note that as a senator, she didn't really do much in the foreign policy realm, and her interviews over the last couple of years on issues like Ukraine and NATO have ranged from kind of rote recitations of diplomatic nothing speak to sometimes actually some pretty bungling responses, and it's not really clear she has a firm grasp on foreign policy, so it would be instructive to voters if she were to lay out what her vision for America and the world is. Fourth question, what is your vision for what a strong and fair economy looks like? One of the really fascinating things to me in observing this election is the argument over whether or not the economy, and this is before this week's events, whether or not the economy was strong. And so much of it kind of depended on which metrics you used to assess the economy. Probably overall, right, with the exception of inflation, the economy has done exceptionally well given where we started 4 years ago. The retort is, well, inflation is kind of the whole thing. It's like the old, other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play? For a lot of people, inflation is how the economy interacts with them. If you are a paycheck to paycheck person and life suddenly becomes much more expensive, then that's what you feel is the strength of the economy. So you don't have a stock portfolio. If someone tells you that the economy grew at 3%, that has no meaning for you. The entirety of the economy is inflation. And so one thing that Harris has to do is tackle the inflation issue as an issue, but also create a broader narrative for people to understand how, whether, and why the economy is strong and what her vision for a strong economy going forward needs to be. She also needs to distance herself from a lot of the language she used in the past when she was running for California Senate. She leaned heavily into this equity equality thing, which is great language if you're running for the Democratic Party's nomination in California, but is not great if you're trying to, convince white voters in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania to vote for you. So how she frames her vision of American economic success will be important and needs to be well thought out, because I think her reflexive go-to ideas aren't going to sell well in a general election. And lastly, how and on what issues will you find ways to build consensus with the Republicans? Now, this always happens in a presidential election, is both sides will present ideas that bluntly will not get through Congress. And she will not, my guess is, if she wins, Vice President Harris, as President Harris, will not have both houses of Congress. Nikki Haley was probably the only person in this election cycle who was honest about the fact that on abortion, for instance, we need to find ways to come to a legislative agreement that accounts for the fact that there are really entrenched beliefs. And so you have to come to some type of compromise that is maybe akin to, for instance, of the rules that they have in Europe about abortion. But either side, either a national abortion ban or legislation that guarantees the right to abortion the entire 9 months, it's unlikely that either thing is going to pass. So you either have to just decide to let states handle it or work to create a consensus on the issue for something like a 15, 20, 25, whatever week abortion law, right? And so there are going to be a lot of issues like that where a lot of times simply asking someone what are they willing to compromise on will force them to give you an answer. The overarching theme of all 5 of these questions is kind of who is Kamala Harris? A lot of the write-ups of her that I've been reading over the last couple of weeks rather, have leaned into this idea that she's kind of intentionally unknowable, that she likes to kind of keep her personal life personal. But that's also not how American voters like to operate. We like to bring out the lockpicks and get into your head and figure out what your values are, what your family is like, who you are as a person. Those things matter. And especially I think it's going to matter because it seems that the line of attack that Republicans are going to use against her is that she's just an ambitious careerist. And ambition is one of those attacks that works especially well against women, unfortunately, because it has a different resonance when you're talking about a woman than with a man. I think men can be more unapologetically ambitious without having to explain that, I'm still a good person, I still have ethics and values, whereas women, unfortunately, aren't afforded that luxury. And so she will need to somehow allow people to know her, what her values are, what her highest aspirations are. She's going to need to find ways to kind of speak to the American values in ways that are more resonant. And honestly, it's hard. Hillary Clinton wasn't quite able to thread that needle. And to be blunt, we don't have a successful model of a woman who's been able to express kind of the fullness of her authentic self and win the presidency. And there is an additional weight that's placed on women to be contradictory things. And you just kind of, unfortunately, they often have to accept the fact that they're going to be attacked unfairly for things that their male counterparts would not be. And that male counterparts, like Donald Trump especially, will get away with things that they never could. That being said, this is going to come down to her ability to craft a narrative about the future and to do it from a position where Americans feel like they know her and they trust her. And that's going to mean that she has to let people know who she is. All right. Thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe. And if you have any comments, I do read them all and I love responding to you guys. So please do that. All right. I'll see you tomorrow.